The city didn't fall apart loudly. Systems failed in the wrong order. Emergency lines crossed themselves. Crimes resolved before response teams arrived. A hijacked convoy stopped without footage. A soup fight ended with no victor, no witness, no headline. By the time analysts noticed the pattern, it was already gone. Saitama had passed through the chaos without realizing it mattered. He redirected disasters the way someone avoids puddles on the sidewalk, without effort, without interest, without leaving a name behind. No speech, no recognition, just problems that stopped happening. Vought couldn't explain it. The boys couldn't track it. Homelander couldn't stand it. Because something far worse than defeat had begun to spread. The world wasn't being saved. It was being stabilized by someone who didn't even know he was there. And if this much changed while Saitama was still around? What happens when he leaves the universe behind completely? This story doesn't escalate with fights. It escalates through absence, consequences, and systems quietly breaking or surviving. If you want to follow what happens after the strongest man stops caring enough to stay, subscribe once. The next part doesn't announce itself, and missing it means missing the moment everything truly changes. No one noticed the first fix. A freight truck carrying volatile compound V derivatives jackknifed on a rain-slick overpass just before rush hour. The driver panicked, clipped the barrier, and sent the trailer skidding toward a line of stalled cars. Emergency calls spiked. Vought Dispatch flagged it as a developing incident with high collateral probability. Saitama was there because he'd taken the wrong exit. He stepped into the road, caught the trailer with one hand, and set it down upright before the first siren reached the bridge. The driver stared. Traffic resumed. Within 2 minutes, the entire event downgraded itself into a paperwork anomaly. No explosion, no injuries, no headline. By the time Vaught's response team arrived, there was nothing to respond to. They logged it as a false alarm. Across the city, Homelander hovered above a studio rooftop, waiting for his cue. A live broadcast had been prepped around a developing chemical disaster. When the call came in canceling it, his smile froze. "What do you mean resolved?" He snapped into his comm. "Contained," a handler replied. "No incident." Homelander clenched his jaw, scanning the skyline like it had betrayed him personally. Later that night, a soup-turf fight ignited in a narrow block near a housing project. Two mid-tier assets clashed over territory neither could afford to lose. Concrete shattered. Windows blew out. Residents screamed and scattered. Saitama walked through the block carrying a plastic grocery bag. He watched the fight for a second, waiting for it to finish. It didn't. One soup lunged toward civilians. Saitama stepped forward, tapped the soup's shoulder, and redirected him straight down into the pavement. The other froze mid-swing. "Hey," Saitama said, "take it somewhere else." The second soup nodded, ran. By the time local responders arrived, they found one unconscious offender embedded neatly in asphalt in a block that looked oddly intact. No fires. No bodies, minimal damage. The report read like fiction. Vought quietly reclassified the incident as non-escalatory. Butcher watched the footage later in a grimy safe house, replaying it twice. "That's not Vought," he muttered. Huey leaned closer. "Who is that guy?" Butcher didn't answer. He didn't like questions without targets. Saitama went home, ate dinner, and forgot about both incidents by morning. Over the next few days, it kept happening. A collapsing construction crane that never finished falling. A hostage situation that ended before negotiators arrived. A riot that lost its momentum when the central agitator was removed so cleanly no one noticed how. Each time, Saitama happened to be nearby. Each time, he fixed the immediate problem with minimal effort. Each time, the world rebalanced itself fast enough that no one could point to a single cause. Crime stats dipped in isolated pockets. Insurance models jittered. Vaught's internal dashboards showed inconsistencies that didn't map to any known asset. Ashley Barrett frowned at the numbers during a morning briefing. "These drops," she said, tapping the screen, "they don't correlate with deployments." "Could be reporting delays," an analyst offered. Ashley shook her head. "They're too clean." Homelander wasn't mentioned in the meeting. That bothered him. He felt it before he understood it, a thinning of attention, fewer alerts, fewer crises that needed his face, his voice, his approval. He flew patrol longer, slower, waiting for something big enough to remind the world who mattered. It didn't come. Instead, a subway derailment that should have been catastrophic resolved itself between stations. Passengers walked out shaken but alive. Vought blamed emergency braking software. The city thanked infrastructure upgrades. Saitama had been there because he'd heard the screech and thought something sounded off. He went back to shopping. The boys started tracking the gaps. Frenchie flagged a pattern first. "These events," he said, pulling maps onto a cracked laptop, "they stop where this guy goes." Butcher scowled. "That's not a thing." "It is now," Huey said quietly. They didn't have a name, just blurry footage. A bald guy in a cheap suit. No branding, no threats, no posturing. He didn't even look like he knew he was being filmed half the time. Kimiko watched one clip and tilted her head. No fear, just curiosity. Homelander finally crossed paths with Saitama outside a collapsed office building that never finished collapsing. Homelander landed hard, cape snapping, cameras trailing him like obedient insects. He took in the scene, rescued civilians dispersing, responders standing down, no enemy in sight. "Hey," Homelander called out, "this area's under Vought jurisdiction." Saitama looked up. "Oh, okay." He stepped aside to let Homelander pass. That was it. No recognition, no awe, no reaction at all. Homelander hovered there, momentarily unanchored, before barking orders that no one seemed eager to follow. The cameras lingered on his confusion longer than they should have. Saitama walked away. That interaction never aired in full. Clips were edited, context trimmed. Vaught's PR reframed it as coordinated response. Homelander smiled on camera later, but something in his eyes had shifted. The world didn't celebrate the changes. It didn't even notice them. But things were quieter, tensions diffused before boiling. Subs hesitated more often, as if something unseen had disrupted the rhythm of escalation they relied on. Vought couldn't explain it. The boys couldn't weaponize it. And Saitama didn't think about it at all. Then late one evening, a Vought black site lost power. Security feeds cut out mid-frame. Containment alarms tripped and then fell silent. Whatever was inside didn't escape, because when backup generators kicked in, every reinforced door was intact, every threat neutralized, every cell inexplicably secure. Saitama stood outside the facility eating a discounted bento, listening to distant sirens fade. "Huh," he said, "must have fixed itself." He tossed the empty container in a bin and kept walking. Behind him, Vought scrambled to understand why their most dangerous facility had survived a failure that should have torn it open. And somewhere deep in their systems, a new anomaly flag appeared for the first time. Unattributed stabilization event. They didn't know it yet, but they had just missed their last chance to notice him before everything started unraveling faster than they could react. The problem wasn't what happened. It was what didn't. Vaught's predictive models were designed around escalation curves, conflict rising, peaking, then resolving through intervention, suppression, or catastrophe. Those curves had shaped everything from insurance pricing to soup deployment schedules. When incidents stopped peaking, the math broke. At first, analysts blamed data lag, then sensor malfunction, then human error, but the pattern refused to go away. Events initiated normally, stress, violence, instability, but somewhere before collapse, momentum vanished. The models called it statistical noise. Ashley Barrett didn't. She called it absence. She stared at a heat map showing a downtown corridor with inexplicably low incident density. No new infrastructure, no recent VOT presence, no policy changes, just calm, not peace, calm like a room after someone leaves. Cross-reference civilian footage, she ordered. The footage didn't help. Cameras caught fragments, a bald man stepping into frame and out again, disasters losing their edge, people dispersing before fear could settle. Nothing dramatic, nothing viral, nothing marketable. Homelander felt the silence like static in his bones. He patrolled longer now, hovering above streets that should have been loud. Sirens were rarer, crises smaller. When something did happen, it ended before he arrived. He blamed handlers, then city officials, then VOT. "You're holding back calls," he snapped in a debrief. "No, sir," the handler said. "There just haven't been any." Homelander's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how this works." But it was. The boys moved differently now, less reactive, more observational. Huey tracked incident reports and marked where nothing happened instead of where something did. "Look," he said, pointing to a cluster of near events. "These should have gone bad." "But they didn't," MM replied. "But they almost did," Huey said, like something nudged them sideways. Butcher didn't like nudges, he liked causes. They found Saitama again near a waterfront dispute that never escalated into a riot. Protesters argued. Tensions rose. Then the loudest agitator went flying, not brutally, just far enough to lose the crowd's attention. Saitama leaned against a railing, watching the water. Butcher approached him like a man stepping onto thin ice. "You with VOT?" Butcher asked. Saitama shook his head. "No." "Government?" "No." "Then what are you?" Saitama thought about it for half a second. "Just helping." Butcher stared at him, searching for ego, threat, ambition. He found none. "That's not an answer," Butcher growled. Saitama shrugged. "It's the only one I've got." Before Butcher could press further, police arrived, too late to matter, right on time to interrupt. By the time they turned back, Saitama was gone. The silence followed him. VOT escalated quietly. Ashley authorized deeper dives into anomaly reports, not to capture, not to confront, just to understand. The analysts stitched together timelines, movement patterns, probability overlaps. They discovered something unsettling. Where Saitama passed through, escalation probability dropped, not immediately but persistently. Subs hesitated. Civilians complied faster. Conflicts lost urgency. It wasn't fear. It was irrelevance. Homelander crossed paths with Saitama again during a staged rescue that never needed staging. Homelander landed to applause that felt thinner than usual. Saitama stood nearby, hands in pockets, watching firefighters do their job. "You like stealing scenes?" Homelander asked, voice tight. Saitama blinked. "I wasn't doing anything." Homelander laughed too loudly. "Right, sure." He turned to the cameras and launched into a speech that hit every practiced beat. When it ended, the applause came, but it didn't swell. People glanced past him, toward the street, toward nothing. Saitama left before the broadcast wrapped. Later, Homelander rewatched the footage alone, not the edited version, the raw feed. His smile faltered when he noticed how often the camera drifted off him, as if distracted by something that wasn't there anymore. The silence wasn't just external. It got inside people. Sups pulled punches more often. Criminals aborted plans mid-action. Negotiators found cooperation easier without understanding why. The world behaved like it had already been corrected. And corrections don't announce themselves. The boys debated what to do about Saitama. "He's not the problem," Huey argued. He's the absence of one. Butcher slammed his fist into the table. There's always a problem. If it ain't him, it's what happens when he leaves. That thought lingered. Saitama, meanwhile, grew restless, not challenged, just unoccupied. He wandered the city, helped when he bumped into trouble, and felt like he was arriving late to conversations that had already ended. No one asked him to stay. No one asked him to leave. That bothered him more than hostility would have. The tipping point came quietly. A coordinated soup operation meant to crack down on an unlicensed compound V lab stalled when every participant hesitated at once. No shots fired, no confrontation, just a sudden shared sense that this wasn't necessary. The lab was shut down peacefully. Vaught's internal review labeled the operation a success. Homelander watched the report and felt something twist. They hadn't needed him. They hadn't needed anyone. They had needed less. Saitama passed by the lab hours later, saw the sealed doors and nodded. Good, he said. He didn't know the lab had been one of Vaught's biggest risks. He didn't know Homelander had planned to make it a spectacle. He didn't know the boys had hoped it would expose something rotten. He just kept walking. That night, Ashley Barrett stared at a projection showing incident frequency declining across multiple sectors. Not enough to trigger alarms, enough to erase leverage. Something's wrong, she said. What? An analyst asked. We're losing tension, Ashley replied, and tension is how control works. Somewhere in the city, Saitama stood at a bus stop, checked the schedule and frowned. The bus arrived early. He boarded, sat down, and looked out the window as the city slid past, quieter, steadier, and completely unaware of why. Behind him, Homelander crushed a glass in his hand without realizing it. Because whatever that man was doing, whatever he represented, it wasn't fighting. It was ending things before they could matter. And if silence kept following him, then sooner or later, someone was going to try to break it. Vought did not announce an investigation. It never did when it didn't want something to feel real. Instead, access privileges shifted quietly. Analysts were reassigned under the language of cross-functional review. Data silos opened that were never meant to touch. Old incident logs were pulled, not for what they showed, but for what they lacked. Ashley Barrett watched the pattern form in negative space. Escalation curves that never peaked, deployments that never triggered, assets placed on standby that stayed there until boredom, not success, ended the shift. The system wasn't being defeated. It was being preempted. Show me everything that didn't happen, Ashley said. The request confused her staff more than any emergency order ever had. They complied anyway. The compilation was unsettling. It wasn't a spike or a crash. It was a thinning, like someone had gently erased friction from the city. Not everywhere, not always, just enough that pressure never reached breaking point. And running through the gaps, barely visible unless you already knew to look, was the same unremarkable figure. No aliases, no brand presence, no contractual footprint. Just proximity. Homelander felt the pattern turn against him before Vought did. He'd built his sense of gravity around reaction, fear, awe, attention. The city used to bend toward him instinctively. Now it bent early before he arrived, like it had learned how to finish the sentence without him. He confronted a handler in private. Why am I not first call anymore? The handler hesitated. You're still our top asset. That's not what I asked. A pause, then. Situations have been resolving. Homelander smiled thinly. Without me. The handler didn't answer. That night, Homelander hunted the silence. He followed police scanners, emergency channels, even civilian social feeds. He chased anything that smelled like escalation, arriving early, fast, aggressive, only to find nothing left to dominate. A collapsed stairwell already stabilized. A robbery stopped by compliance instead of fear. A soup disturbance that dissolved the moment he showed up, like it had already learned the consequences. Then he saw him again. Saitama stood outside a convenience store, holding a bag of discounted bread, listening to two men argue loudly near a parked car. The argument fizzled when Saitama stepped closer, not threatening, not even aware of them, just present. They noticed him. They stopped. Homelander landed hard enough to crack pavement. "You," he said, pointing. Saitama looked up. "Oh, hi." The cameras came out late this time. No one had called them. The moment felt off. Homelander circled him, voice lowering. "You following me?" Saitama blinked. "No." "Then why do things stop when you show up?" Saitama thought about it. "They don't. I just help when I see something." Homelander laughed, sharp and hollow. "You think that's all this is?" Saitama shrugged. "It seems like enough." The silence pressed in around them. No cheering, no fear, just people watching two figures they didn't fully understand. Homelander stepped back first. Not because he was afraid. Because there was nothing to push against. He left without a speech. The footage went viral anyway, not because it was dramatic, but because it was empty. Homelander, center frame, reduced to noise by a man who didn't acknowledge the performance. Vought buried the clip under algorithmic sludge. It didn't matter. The boys saw the pattern crystallize next. Laid it out on the table, maps, timestamps, near misses. It's not coincidence. He's not reacting to events. He's erasing the conditions that cause them. "But he's not planning," Huey said. "He's just there." "That's the scary part," replied. "You don't need intent to be a constant." Butcher rubbed his face. "So what happens when the constant leaves?" No one answered. Because the pattern had reached the point of dependence without anyone agreeing to it. Subs adjusted unconsciously. Criminals delayed. Negotiators shortened timelines. Everyone behaved like escalation was no longer guaranteed. And systems that rely on escalation for leverage began to starve. Vought felt it in their quarterly projections. Risk was down. Engagement was down harder. Fear metrics dipped below baseline. Crisis to content conversion plummeted. You couldn't sell salvation if nothing needed saving. Ashley presented the findings to the board without nomming Saitama. "It's not sustainable," she said. "We're losing narrative velocity." One executive frowned. "Are you saying we need more disasters?" "I'm saying," Ashley replied carefully, "that something is interfering with causality." The room went quiet. "That's not possible," someone said. Ashley didn't argue. Instead, she authorized Phase 1 classification. Anomalous stabilization vector. Not an enemy, not an asset, a variable. They started tracking Saitama directly. Not aggressively, not visibly, just triangulation, cameras, metadata, movement prediction. The results disturbed even the skeptics. Wherever he went, incident probability decayed over time, not instantly, gradually, like friction being worn down by repetition. He didn't stop crime. He stopped escalation. Homelander learned about the classification through a leak. He read the phrase 3 times. "Stabilization vector," he whispered. He smashed the tablet into the wall. "They're replacing me," he said aloud to an empty room. But replacement implied intent. This wasn't replacement. This was obsolescence. Saitama noticed the watchers eventually. Not the cameras, those didn't register, but the way people lingered longer now. The way responders hesitated when he arrived, unsure whether to defer or proceed. It annoyed him in a dull, low-grade way. He helped less. Not because he was angry. Because it felt unnecessary. And the less he helped, the more the pattern stood out, like silence after a song cuts off too soon. Vaught's models started compensating. They reintroduced controlled escalation in select zones, timed responses to restore urgency, carefully curated crises meant to reassert dominance over the narrative. It backfired, because Saitama wandered into one by accident and ended it before it could justify itself. The report landed on Ashley's desk with a single annotation from an analyst. "We can't outpace this." Ashley stared at the words. Not defeat. Recognition. The pattern wasn't hostile. It wasn't strategic. It didn't care. And that made it impossible to negotiate with. That night Saitama sat on his couch, flipping channels, bored. He hadn't saved the world. He hadn't broken it. But somewhere in the machinery of power, a realization was forming. Nothing had become a pattern. And patterns, once seen, demand response. The first sign wasn't a collapse. It was hesitation. Police departments across 3 cities reported the same anomaly within 48 hours. Response times lengthened even as incident volume dropped, not because of understaffing or confusion, but because officers paused. They waited for escalation that didn't come. They approached situations already half resolved, suspects subdued by compliance instead of fear. No one said Saitama's name in official reports. They didn't need to. Vaught's internal dashboard showed a more troubling metric. Crisis dependency had spiked. Systems designed to respond to chaos were now seeking it, stretching minor disturbances into potential flashpoints just to justify deployment. The world wasn't safer. It was quieter. And quiet broke business models. Ashley Barrett convened a closed executive session, excluding Homelander for the first time in years. The omission wasn't strategic. It was instinctive. Every data set suggested he was no longer central to outcomes. "We're losing control of escalation," she said, not bothering with euphemisms. "Not because of interference, because people are adapting." An executive leaned forward. "To what?" Ashley hesitated. "To the absence of consequence." The room didn't like that phrasing. Outside corporate towers and boardrooms, the adjustment was messier. Subs felt it first, not as fear but as redundancy. Patrols ended early. Threats resolved themselves. Civilians didn't panic on cue anymore. Fear had lost its timing. Homelander tried to force relevance back into the system. He staged a public intervention without Vaught's clearance. Dramatic entry, elevated threat language, full performance. He expected resistance, awe, at least reaction. Instead, the crowd filmed him with polite distance. Someone asked if things were already handled. That question hollowed him out faster than any punch ever could. He finished the scene anyway, shouting at a danger that no longer existed, and left before the applause that never came could finish not arriving. The clip trended for an hour, then disappeared under videos of people arguing about whether heroes were still necessary at all. The boys watched the shift from a safe house, uneasy. "This isn't victory," Butcher said. "It's withdrawal." Huey nodded slowly. "It's like the system realized it doesn't need a villain or a savior, just less pressure." "And what happens when pressure comes back?" MM asked. No one answered. Because pressure always comes back. Saitama didn't notice the adjustment consciously. He just felt less busy, fewer interruptions, fewer moments where stepping in felt useful. He spent more time grocery shopping, more time sitting on his couch watching shows he didn't care about. Once, he stopped a mugging by standing nearby and asking for directions. The mugger apologized. That stuck with him, not emotionally, just as a data point that didn't resolve into anything meaningful. "People are weird," he muttered and moved on. Vought escalated containment without calling it containment. They adjusted zoning, rerouted Saitama's movement patterns subtly, encouraged him toward lower-density areas through manipulated transit delays and service outages. Not to trap him, to sideline him. The models predicted reduced stabilization effects if his exposure dropped below a critical threshold. The models were wrong. The effect lingered, like momentum without mass. Entire districts remained calmer long after Saitama passed through. Social behavior shifted. Conflict de-escalated faster. Even Vought-controlled SUPs reported difficulty-provoking reactions they'd relied on for years. Fear had become inefficient. Ashley received a private briefing from internal ethics. Not about Saitama. About liability. If this continues, the report warned, Vought may be exposed as unnecessary. Ashley closed the file without comment. Homelander confronted her that night. "You're cutting me out," he said. Ashley didn't deny it. "We're restructuring." "Because of him." "Because of the world," she corrected. "It's changing." Homelander leaned closer, then changed it back. Ashley met his gaze evenly. "We don't know how." That answer broke something irreparable between them. The world adjusted faster after that. Not toward order. Toward indifference. Crime didn't vanish. It became smaller, quieter, less theatrical. SUPs stopped posturing and started hesitating. Authority figures lost their leverage when threats no longer escalated predictably. No one celebrated. Because celebration implies intention. This wasn't intention. It was adaptation. The boys felt it in their bones. Their plans relied on chaos, on pressure points, on villains predictable enough to manipulate. With the system flattening itself, there was nothing left to aim at. "This is worse," Butcher said finally. "We don't even get to fight." Saitama stood on a rooftop one evening, watching the city glow without urgency. He felt out of place, not because he was needed, but because he was. He checked the time. Nothing to do. He left early. No one noticed immediately. But absence, like presence, leaves patterns behind. And the moment Saitama stopped being a constant, the world began to ask questions it wasn't ready to answer. The first attempt was subtle. Vought didn't announce a change in direction. It never did. Instead, messaging adjusted tone by fractions of a percent. Threat levels were nudged upward. News anchors lingered longer on violence, replaying shaky footage until it felt larger than it was. Analysts were instructed to frame hesitation as danger, calm as vulnerability. Fear, they believed, just needed encouragement. It didn't work. Viewership dipped. Engagement metrics flattened. The more Vought pushed urgency, the more the public reacted with skepticism instead of panic. Comment sections filled with the same phrase, repeated in different forms. "Why does this feel forced?" Ashley Barrett watched the numbers update in real time, jaw tight. This wasn't backlash. Backlash was loud. This was indifference, the same quiet resistance Homelander had felt in the street. Systems built on escalation were encountering friction they couldn't overcome. The next attempt was louder. Vought authorized controlled SUP deployments into high-visibility zones, not to stop threats, but to create moments. Crimes were interrupted at the peak of tension. Cameras were pre-positioned. Dialogue was scripted just loosely enough to look organic. Homelander led the first wave. He hit his marks perfectly, nailed the cadence, delivered the speech with just enough edge to feel authentic. From a technical standpoint, it was flawless. The response was muted. People watched. They didn't cheer. They didn't scatter. Some even walked past him mid-monologue, phones lowered, attention already drifting. The clip trended for 20 minutes, then fell behind a video of a city council meeting where residents debated cutting Vought contracts entirely. Homelander smashed a wall backstage. "Run it again," he demanded. Ashley shook her head. We're burning credibility. We are credibility, he snapped. No, she said quietly, we were. Behind closed doors, the science division reached the same conclusion from a different angle. Behavioral models showed long-tail stabilization, effects persisting without reinforcement. Something had reset public expectation of threat response. Not removed fear. Redefined it. People no longer expected escalation. They expected resolution. That expectation made traditional power displays obsolete. Vought's board panicked. Not openly. That would imply loss of control. Instead, budgets were shifted, research resurrected. Projects that had been mothballed for being too aggressive were quietly reactivated. If fear couldn't be sold, it would be demonstrated. The first test went wrong. A mid-tier soup was overclocked on a new Compound V variant and deployed into a controlled zone under the guise of a malfunction. The intent was a narrow window of chaos followed by decisive intervention. Instead, civilians evacuated calmly. No screaming, no stampede. Emergency services coordinated without waiting for heroes. Local responders contained the soup long enough for Vought to step in, but the optics were ruined. The narrative didn't land. The public didn't thank Vought. They asked why the soup had been there at all. Ashley received a call from a senator within the hour. You're manufacturing instability, he said flatly. Ashley didn't deny it. We're preventing worse outcomes. From what? She paused. He hung up. The boys watched the escalation with growing unease. They're flailing, Huey said. But flailing corporations don't go quietly, MM replied. Butcher stared at a wall of screens showing failed Vought interventions stacked one after another. They're trying to bring the monster back, he said. Problem is, they don't realize the monster already left. Saitama was 3 cities away, browsing discount vegetables. He noticed prices were lower, lines shorter, less tension in the air. He chalked it up to timing. When a minor earthquake rattled the block, he steadied a leaning building out of habit, then went back to shopping. No alerts went out. No hero arrived. The situation resolved itself. That absence echoed louder than intervention ever had. Vought escalated again. This time they bypassed Homelander. A classified asset was deployed without branding, without announcement. A living weapon built for uncontrollable situations, something meant to force reaction. The moment it activated, response grids stalled. Not from fear. From confusion. No one knew how to react to a threat that didn't fit the old patterns. Civilians sheltered, emergency responders coordinated, media hesitated, Vought scrambled to frame the event as external. It wasn't enough. The asset was neutralized by combined local forces before Homelander even arrived. The footage went viral. Not because of destruction. Because of competence. Ashley watched the clip in silence. Shut it down, she ordered. An aide hesitated, all of it. Ashley closed her eyes. Before they realize they don't need us. Homelander arrived late, hovering over a scene that had already stabilized. He looked down at responders packing up, civilians dispersing calmly. No one looked up at him. For the first time, there was no script to fall back on. He hovered there too long. Cameras didn't cut away. They captured the stillness, the uncertainty, the god without an audience. Saitama, meanwhile, finished his shopping and headed home. He checked the time again. Still nothing to do. And as Vought tried desperately to reassert control over a world that had quietly learned to function without spectacle, something deeper broke. Not a system. An assumption. That power had to announce itself to matter. The collapse didn't announce itself with fire or sirens. It arrived as paperwork. Contracts expired and weren't renewed. Municipal budgets quietly reallocated funds once earmarked for Vought security toward infrastructure, social services, and independent emergency response units. No one made a speech about it. City councils simply voted, numbers ticking over with procedural indifference. Vought noticed too late. By the time Ashley Barrett received the first consolidated report, 12 major cities had already reduced their reliance on corporate hero coverage by more than 40%. The justifications were bland, almost insulting in their simplicity. Cost efficiency, redundancy reduction, improved local coordination. No mention of Saitama, no mention of Homelander. Just absence. Inside Vought Tower, entire departments went idle. Analysts kept running projections that refused to escalate. Risk models flattened. Simulated crises resolved themselves before reaching monetizable thresholds. A junior executive said the quiet part out loud during a closed meeting. What if people don't want us anymore? The room went still. Ashley didn't reprimand him. She didn't need to. The silence did the work. Everyone there understood the difference between losing public favor and losing relevance entirely. Homelander felt it before the numbers confirmed it. He tried flying patrols without instruction. Hopping raw presence would trigger something, fear, awe, anything. He hovered over intersections, rooftops, public squares. People noticed him the way they noticed weather, with brief acknowledgement, then continued on. A kid waved. Homelander waved back automatically, then froze when the kid turned away mid-gesture. The cameras caught it. Not the wave. The pause. It circulated without commentary, stripped of music and context. Just a man in the sky, unsure what to do next. The boys watched the clip in silence. "This is wrong," MM said finally. "This isn't how power is supposed to fall." Butcher clenched his jaw. "It's worse. No explosion, no villain, just erosion." Huey leaned forward. "This is what happens when someone shows the world power that doesn't care. Everything else starts to look fake." Outside the noise of institutions, ordinary people adjusted faster than anyone expected. Neighborhoods organized. Disputes de-escalated because escalation felt unnecessary. SUPs found themselves sidelined, not through hostility, but through irrelevance. A mid-tier hero quit on live stream. "I don't think I'm helping," she said, voice steady, "and I don't want to pretend anymore." The stream didn't go viral. It didn't need to. Others followed. Vought attempted a narrative pivot, rebranding heroes as community partners instead of protectors, but the language rang hollow. People could tell when a role existed to fill space rather than need. Ashley ordered an internal audit. The findings were devastating. Vaught's value wasn't tied to outcomes. It was tied to spectacle. And spectacle, once seen as optional, couldn't be reintroduced without looking manipulative. She stared at the report long after the room emptied. This wasn't defeat. It was obsolescence. Saitama noticed the quiet only when it inconvenienced him. The supermarket near his apartment changed hours. Less security, fewer guards. A manager apologized for the confusion. "Things have been calmer lately," the man said. "We're adjusting." Saitama nodded. "That's good." He meant it literally. No deeper thought followed. Later that week, he encountered a small-time villain robbing an ATM. Saitama stood nearby, waiting to see if someone else would intervene. They did. Not a hero. 3 bystanders talked the guy down. One called local responders. The situation ended without drama. Saitama blinked, then walked away. "Guess I wasn't needed," he muttered. That thought didn't trouble him. It felt efficient. Vought tried one last escalation. A coordinated global event, carefully curated, Multiple heroes deployed simultaneously in high-risk zones, timed for maximum exposure. Homelander was positioned as the centerpiece, framed as reassurance in uncertain times. The event failed before it began. Local authorities declined coordination. International partners refused broadcast rights. Social platforms flagged the buildup as artificial. When Homelander landed on schedule, he did so in a space that no longer needed him. He delivered the speech anyway. The words echoed against buildings that didn't echo back. Ashley watched from her office as the feed numbers stalled, then dropped. She closed the window. Behind her, a secure phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. "Proceed," she said. On the other end, a voice confirmed the order. Containment protocols were being activated. Not for Saitama. For information. Black budgets dissolved, sensitive research archived or destroyed, assets quietly relocated. Vought wasn't fighting back. It was retreating. Homelander wasn't informed. He found out when his access badge failed. He stood in a hallway he'd owned for years, staring at a red light that didn't recognize him. "Open the door," he said calmly. Nothing happened. For the first time, there was no handler rushing to explain, no damage control team scrambling behind the scenes. Just a locked door. The boys heard about it hours later. "He's done," Butcher said, almost disappointed. "Not dead," Huey replied, "just left behind." Saitama packed a bag that night. Nothing formal, just a few essentials. He checked his calendar out of habit, found it empty. No alerts. No disturbances. No reason to stay. He paused at the door, looked back at the apartment. "Guess that's that," he said to no one. He left without announcement. The world didn't notice immediately. But systems did. Within days, the last artificial escalations failed to materialize. Vaught's presence faded into bureaucracy and investigations. Homelander vanished from headlines, then from conversation. And in the vacuum left by a power that never claimed credit, something new began to form. Not a replacement. A question. If this much stability came from someone who didn't even realize he mattered. What happens when the world figures it out? The first week after Saitama's departure passed without announcement. No alert sounded. No spike registered. Emergency channels remained quieter than historical averages, and response grids continued operating at reduced intensity. Analysts flagged the trend as an anomaly, then hesitated to escalate it. Nothing was wrong enough to justify concern. That absence of urgency became the problem. Without Saitama present, without even the possibility of him, the world began to test itself. Not consciously, not maliciously. Small risks crept back in. Minor power grabs. Low-level subs testing boundaries they'd stopped pushing weeks earlier. They expected resistance. They didn't get much. But they also didn't get applause. A supe tried to intimidate a city council vote. The council called his bluff and adjourned. Another threatened a strike for higher compensation. Vought declined to respond at all. A third attempted a public spectacle and found himself arrested by local authorities who had already coordinated a response before he finished speaking. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Power still existed. It just didn't command the room anymore. Homelander felt the shift as suffocation. He was still free, still alive, still physically unmatched by anyone left in the system, but nothing reacted to him the way it used to, not with fear, not with awe, not even with hatred. Silence followed him like an echo that refused to bounce back. He tried calling old contacts, handlers who no longer answered, executives who forwarded him to legal departments, lawyers who spoke in liability language instead of reverence. "Your status is under review," one of them said. Homelander laughed at that. Then he realized no one else was laughing. The boys tracked the aftershocks from the outside. "This is the hangover," said, scrolling through reports. "The world's sobering up." Butcher wasn't satisfied. "Don't trust it. Power doesn't vanish, it relocates." Huey frowned. "To where?" Butcher didn't answer. Because he didn't know. And not knowing was worse than any known threat. Globally, governments convened emergency sessions that never made headlines. Classified briefings circulated about a destabilizing factor that had exited without explanation. The reports avoided names. They used phrases like external equalizer and non-participatory actor. One analyst wrote a single line that got buried in footnotes. The system adapted once. It may not adapt again. No one wanted to sign off on that conclusion. In cities that had benefited most from Saitama's unnoticed interventions, crime remained low, but the expectation of rescue had shifted. People no longer waited for heroes. They acted, sometimes clumsily, sometimes effectively. Not better, just differently. That difference unnerved institutions more than chaos ever had. Vaught's collapse accelerated quietly. Subsidiaries shuttered. Research facilities sold off under shell companies. Executives vanished into consulting firms and legal safe havens. The brand remained but hollowed out like a stage prop after the show ended. Homelander was informed of his status change via email. Not a meeting. Not a phone call. An automated message outlining temporary suspension of active deployment pending ongoing review. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he deleted it. That night he flew. Not on patrol, not on assignment. He flew to a familiar rooftop where cameras used to wait for him, where crowds had gathered, where fear and admiration had mixed into something intoxicating. The roof was empty. No lights, no drones, no audience. He hovered there, searching for the feeling that used to come naturally. It didn't come. Across the city, a building caught fire. Homelander heard it. He felt the heat. He could have reached it in seconds. He didn't. Not because he couldn't. Because he wanted to see if anyone would notice he wasn't there. They did. Fire crews arrived. Civilians evacuated. The fire was contained. The news cycle covered it briefly, crediting local response. Homelander watched the coverage afterward. His name wasn't mentioned. That broke him more cleanly than any punch ever could. Saitama, meanwhile, walked through a quiet neighborhood in another universe entirely. He didn't think about the one he'd left. Why would he? Nothing there had demanded his attention. No lingering threat, no unresolved tension that mattered to him. He stopped at a convenience store, browsed shelves, frowned at prices. "Still expensive," he said. Life went on. Back in the boys' universe, the absence settled into permanence. Not peace. Not order. Something thinner. A world that had seen power exercised without ego, without spectacle, without explanation, and now found everything else excessive by comparison. Subs hesitated because intimidation felt childish. Governments hesitated because authority felt performative. The boys hesitated because there was nothing left to expose. Butcher drank more. Huey thought more. Slept less. And somewhere in that quiet, dangerous space between collapse and renewal, something began to grow. Not a hero. Not a villain. A question. If the strongest force they'd ever encountered could leave without caring. What happens when something else arrives that does? The first sign that the quiet was being noticed came from outside the system. Not a soup, not a government, not even a corporation. It came from the markets. Defense contracts spiked in regions that hadn't seen major incidents in years. Private security firms expanded aggressively, advertising reliability instead of strength. New players entered the space with unfamiliar funding sources and no legacy baggage. They weren't trying to replace Vought. They were trying to occupy the space Vought no longer controlled. The vacuum had a gravity of its own. Intelligence agencies flagged the trend as external interest. Quiet probes, test incidents designed to measure response time, coordination, hesitation. The results were encouraging for those watching from afar. The world responded slower now. Not weaker, just unsure. The boys felt it immediately. "This isn't organic," Butcher said, pointing at a map littered with new markers. "Someone's poking the corpse." Frowned. "Could be copycats." "Too clean," Huey replied. "They're not chasing attention, they're measuring." That realization shifted everything. Because measurement implied intent. Homelander sensed it too, though he lacked the language for it. He felt relevance flicker at the edges again, not as admiration but as potential utility. People started returning his calls, not old allies, new ones. Shadow brokers, private firms, off-the-books intermediaries who spoke carefully and listened more than they talked. They didn't worship him. They evaluated him. That alone made him desperate enough to listen. "You're still the strongest thing here," one of them said during a covert meeting. "That matters." Homelander clung to those words like a lifeline. He didn't notice the implication. Vaught's remnants tried to warn authorities quietly, but without leverage their concerns landed like noise. They were treated as interested parties, not experts. The era of default trust was over. In cities where calm had become normal, small disruptions began to feel sharper by contrast. A coordinated blackout here, a precision theft there. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to test whether escalation would trigger response. It didn't. People adapted again. But adaptation takes time. And time was exactly what the observers wanted. Globally unknown actors began mapping response psychology rather than capability. Who waited? Who hesitated? Who acted without approval? Patterns emerged, and with them, opportunity. The absence of Saitama wasn't felt as loss. It was felt as exposure. The boys received confirmation through a backchannel Huey barely trusted. "There are eyes on us," he said quietly, "not from above, from elsewhere." Butcher snorted, "Let M look." Shook his head. "That's how this starts." Homelander made his choice without understanding it. He accepted an offer. Not a contract. A role. They didn't promise adoration. They promised relevance, purpose, a chance to be needed again, not as a symbol but as a deterrent. Homelander told himself it was control. In truth, it was permission. Far away in a place without consequence or memory, Saitama finished a meal and stared at the sky. He felt nothing unusual, no pull, no warning. Just a vague sense that something was louder somewhere else. He ignored it. Back in the boys' universe, the vacuum tightened. And something finally stepped closer to filling it. The problem with irrelevance wasn't humiliation. It was utility. Once Homelander stopped being the center of the world, he became something worse in the hands of people who understood leverage. Not a god, not a hero, a resource, something to be pointed, redirected, and blamed when necessary. The first deployment under the new arrangement was surgical. No cameras, no press. A private compound in Eastern Europe where an unregistered soup cell had taken control of a shipping corridor. Homelander was told it was a test run, a chance to remind the world he still mattered. He arrived fast, he ended it faster. The operation was a success by every measurable metric. 0 civilian casualties, infrastructure intact, objective neutralized. And no one thanked him. The report classified him as effective. That word stuck with him in a way applause never had. Word spread quietly through the same shadow channels that had been watching the vacuum. Homelander wasn't unreliable. He wasn't theatrical anymore. He was efficient when pointed correctly. That made him valuable. The boys learned about the operation 2 days later. Private deployment, Huey said, reading off the file. No oversight, no accountability. Butcher's jaw tightened. They turned him into a gun. Frowned. He always was. No, Butcher replied. He was worse. Guns don't care if you clap. This version of Homelander didn't need validation from the public. He was getting it from results, from quiet nods in secure rooms, from being told he'd done exactly what was required. The absence of spectacle made it feel clean. Too clean. Governments noticed. Not openly. They couldn't admit it, but classified briefings began including phrases like non-state strategic deterrent and externally managed force multiplier. Homelander appeared in threat assessments without a flag attached to him. That ambiguity was dangerous, because it meant no one was responsible for what he did next. The vacuum that Saitama left wasn't being filled by a single power. It was being contested by interests that had waited patiently for chaos to stop screaming so it could start whispering. The world had stabilized enough to be exploitable. And exploitation doesn't need panic. It needs predictability. Homelander became predictable. Not to the public. To handlers who spoke his language now, clear tasks, defined outcomes. No applause but no rejection either. They never praised him, they simply used him again. That was enough. Until it was. The breaking point came during a containment operation in a coastal city. Intelligence suggested a rogue soup collective preparing a demonstration attack, symbolic, disruptive, designed to reintroduce fear into a system that had grown numb. Homelander was deployed preemptively. He arrived early. Too early. The collective hadn't finished mobilizing. Some were unarmed. Some were trying to flee. Homelander didn't adjust. He followed the parameters as given. Neutralize the threat. He did. The aftermath was ugly. Not in scale. In optics. Footage leaked. Not staged, not dramatic. Raw angles, unflattering timing. A man moving too fast for context, ending things before the situation could declare itself. The world reacted, not with terror. With discomfort. This feels unnecessary, one commentator said. He didn't wait, another noted. He didn't have to, someone replied. That sentence spread. He didn't have to. Homelander watched the discourse spiral without him in it. His name trended, then faded behind debates about oversight, authority, and whether anyone should have that kind of power at all. Not him. That kind. For the first time, his actions were being evaluated without emotion. Just impact. He confronted his handler. They're turning on me, he said. The handler didn't deny it. They're reassessing. I did what you told me. You did exactly what you were designed to do, the handler replied calmly. That's the problem. That night Homelander stood alone again, hovering above a city that didn't ask for him. He felt the old anger try to rise, and found it dulled by something worse. Clarity. He wasn't irrelevant anymore. He was replaceable. The boys felt the shift immediately. This is it, said. They're going to cut him loose. Butcher shook his head. No, they're going to aim him somewhere else. Huey swallowed, and when that stops working. Butcher didn't answer. Because everyone knew what came next. Far from all of it, Saitama stretched, yawned, and wondered if he'd missed a sale at the market. He felt a faint pressure in the back of his mind, not concern, not instinct. Just noise. He ignored it. Back in the boys' universe, Irrelevance had finished transforming. It was no longer harmless. It was volatile. And the people who thought they were managing it were about to learn the difference between control and delay. The moment Homelander stopped being the center of gravity, everything around him began to drift. Not explode, not collapse. Drift. The handlers who once spoke with certainty started hedging. Instructions arrived layered with contingencies. Missions that had been framed as decisive became situational. Authorization chains grew longer, not for safety, but to create distance. No one wanted to own the outcome anymore. Homelander noticed the change in tone immediately. Proceed if conditions remain favorable, one message read. He read it twice. Define favorable, he asked. There was a pause on the line, too long. Long enough for him to hear paper shift, someone breathing carefully on the other end. Use your judgment, the handler finally said. That phrase used to mean trust. Now it meant liability transfer. Homelander ended the call without responding. He hovered above the city, watching traffic flow, people move, life continue without any reference to him. The absence gnawed at him, but it was no longer the sharp pain of rejection. It was something colder. Displacement. Power without a center doesn't disappear. It diffuses. And diffusion creates unpredictability far more dangerous than hierarchy ever was. The first consequence appeared in the private sector. Competing firms began fielding their own enhanced assets, not to replace Homelander, but to counterbalance him. None were close in raw strength. That wasn't the point. They were meant to complicate decision-making, to make every deployment a risk calculation instead of a guarantee. The result was paralysis. Local governments stalled, waiting for confirmation that never came. Private security hesitated, unsure which force would intervene. Threats lingered longer than they should have, not because anyone lacked capability, but because no one wanted responsibility. The boys watched the delay stack up. This is what happens when you remove the apex without replacing the structure, MM said. Everyone's scared of being first. Butcher paced. Saitama didn't just leave a hole, he flattened the damn hill. Huey frowned. What does that mean? It means there's no top anymore, Butcher replied. Just people pretending they're not scrambling. Homelander was offered a new role 3 days later. Not by his handlers. By their competitors. A discreet meeting. No contracts, no uniforms, just a promise of autonomy. No oversight, no narrative control. No one telling him when to stop. You'd answer to yourself, the intermediary said. We just make sure you're pointed in useful directions. Homelander almost accepted on the spot. Almost. Something stopped him, not conscience, not fear, but recognition. He'd seen this pattern before. Vought had done the same thing, just with better branding. This wasn't freedom. It was decentralization. He declined without explanation. The intermediary smiled anyway. We'll talk again. Homelander knew that wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. Across the world, the consequences of power without a center became visible. Independent actors filled gaps with conflicting agendas. Some meant well, some didn't. None coordinated. Incidents escalated not because of malice, but because response overlapped and interfered. A private soup unit neutralized a hostage situation just as local responders moved in. Crossfire erupted. Casualties followed. No one claimed responsibility. Everyone denied fault. The public reaction was different this time. Not outrage. Suspicion. People began asking why so many powerful forces existed without accountability, why authority felt fragmented, why safety had become a negotiation instead of a service. The question didn't point at Homelander. It pointed at the system. Vaught's name resurfaced in hearings, not as a villain but as a cautionary example. Lawmakers spoke about consolidation, about oversight, about preventing another unchecked monopoly on power. The irony was brutal. They were trying to rebuild the very structure that had collapsed, without understanding why it had collapsed in the first place. Because none of them could name Saitama. He didn't appear in reports. He didn't appear in footage. His actions were too small, too incidental, too unrecorded to anchor blame or credit. The world knew something had changed. It didn't know who to accuse. Homelander watched it all unfold with growing detachment. For the first time, he wasn't trying to dominate the narrative. He was trying to understand it. That terrified him more than ignorance ever had. He realized something then. Saitama hadn't removed him. He'd removed the need for him. And without that need, Homelander wasn't a god or a monster or even a villain. He was excess. The boys felt the tension tighten. "This isn't over," Huey said quietly. "It's just unanchored." Butcher nodded, and unanchored things don't settle, they collide. Far away, Saitama paused mid-step on a quiet street. He felt that faint pressure again, louder this time, still not concern, more like static bleeding through a channel he didn't listen to. "Huh," he said. Then he shrugged and kept walking. Back in the boys' universe, power without a center continued to spread, fracture, and overlap, setting the stage for something no one could plan for. Not escalation. Correction. And when that correction came, it wouldn't ask who deserved it. The correction didn't arrive as an invasion. It arrived as a miscalculation. A private security coalition, assembled in haste and driven by overlapping interests, initiated a synchronized intervention across 3 cities. The goal was containment, assert authority, demonstrate coordination, remind the world that power still had a center, even if it was fought anymore. They moved too fast. Local authorities weren't looped in. Independent soup teams weren't aligned. Emergency services were caught between conflicting command structures. Every group assumed someone else had the bigger picture. No one did. The first city locked down unnecessarily. Panic rippled not because of danger but because of contradiction. Orders clashed. Evacuation routes overlapped. A routine containment turned into confusion, then injury, then anger. The second city resisted. Citizens refused compliance, citing recent autonomy and local coordination successes. Private assets escalated to force when persuasion failed. Footage leaked within minutes. Not violence. Overreach. The third city was where it broke. A rogue-enhanced asset, never meant to be frontline, was deployed to stabilize optics. He misread the situation, panicked, and leveled a block trying to regain control. That was the moment the world stopped being patient. Markets froze. Governments issued statements they couldn't enforce. Emergency summits convened without consensus. Every attempt to impose authority made the fractures more visible. The correction wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure. The boys were already on the move when the news hit. "This is the spiral," MM said, watching feeds overlap and contradict each other. Everyone learned the wrong lesson. Butcher slammed a fist into the table. They thought they could replace him, replace that. Huey stared at a paused frame of chaos, no clear villain, no hero arriving. They didn't understand what he did. He didn't dominate, he simplified. That understanding came too late. Homelander was offered deployment again. Urgent, unfiltered, desperate. They didn't frame it as a mission. They framed it as necessity. "You're the only one who can stabilize this," the voice said. Homelander hovered in silence after the call ended. He looked down at a city that didn't trust him, didn't fear him, and no longer believed in symbols. He knew that if he went, he'd restore order temporarily and cement the lie permanently. He declined. Not out of growth. out of exhaustion. That refusal sent shockwaves through the shadow networks. The last reliable apex had opted out, not defected, not rebelled. Just stopped. Without him, the coalition fractured further. Accusations replaced coordination. Blame became louder than action. The public didn't rally behind any single force. They withdrew. Neighborhoods closed ranks. Cities leaned inward. Governments focused on borders instead of people. The system didn't collapse in flames. It calcified. Rigid, defensive, brittle. And brittle systems shatter. Saitama felt it then. Not clearly, not emotionally. Just a sense that something was louder than it should be. He stopped walking. Listened. Nothing followed. No pull, no summons, no obligation. So he did what he always did when things felt noisy for no reason. He ignored it. Back in the boys' universe, the cost of learning too late became unavoidable. The world had glimpsed what stability without domination looked like, and then tried to recreate it with domination anyway. The result wasn't tyranny. It was incoherence. And incoherence invites collapse far more reliably than force ever did. The final realization spread quietly through institutions that had survived the initial erosion. They hadn't needed Saitama because he was strong. They'd needed him because he didn't care. And now, without him, they were alone with power that demanded to be seen. The correction had begun. It just wasn't finished yet. The end did not arrive with resolution. It arrived with routines that never came back. Morning news no longer led with crisis, not because danger vanished, but because no single authority could claim it, frame it, or promise to fix it. Coverage shifted to local briefings, community advisories, quiet warnings issued without branding or spectacle. The tone was practical, flat, almost tired. People adjusted. They always did. Subs found themselves boxed in by rules that hadn't existed before. Not laws, those took too long, but norms. Intervention without coordination drew suspicion. Displays of power without necessity were treated as instability rather than reassurance. The crowd that once looked up now stepped back, phones lowered, attention cautious. Power still worked. It just didn't inspire anymore. Homelander vanished from public view without announcement. No press release, no trial, no dramatic fall. He became a rumor that decayed faster each week, a name attached to arguments about what went wrong rather than what might be saved. He survived. But survival wasn't victory. In a quiet apartment far from the towers that once worshipped him, he watched coverage of a city stabilizing itself after a storm. Volunteers coordinated. Local responders worked efficiently. No soup arrived to punctuate the moment. He waited for the ache. It didn't come. What came instead was emptiness, so complete it felt final. Vought International dissolved on paper months later. Not in bankruptcy court, not under scandalous indictment, but through acquisition, divestment, and regulatory suffocation. The logo disappeared from uniforms first, then from buildings, then from memory. Executives resurfaced in consultancy roles, think tanks, academic panels where they spoke carefully about lessons learned. None of them could articulate the real one. The boys disbanded without ceremony. Took a job advising municipal coordination teams, applying the lessons learned from chaos without trying to recreate it. Frenchie and Kimiko disappeared into a life that didn't require vigilance every waking hour. Huey stayed in public service, advocating transparency with the quiet certainty of someone who'd seen what power looked like when it didn't ask permission. Butcher held out the longest. He waited for a target that never came. When he finally stopped, it wasn't because he'd forgiven the world. It was because the world no longer offered him a shape to fight. He hated that. He hated that the strongest force to ever touch their reality had left without caring whether they understood. But deep down, he knew that was the point. Globally, the correction settled into permanence. Power didn't vanish. It decentralized, fractured, hardened into smaller, accountable forms that could fail without dragging entire systems down with them. Violence didn't end. It became less theatrical, more contained, less useful as currency. Fear stopped working the way it used to. And once fear loses its leverage, everything else has to change. Historians would later argue about the turning point. Some would cite economic shifts. Others would point to political fatigue. A few fringe analysts would talk about an unrecorded anomaly, an unidentified stabilizing variable that exited the system before it could be named. They would never agree, because the truth was untraceable. Saitama didn't leave a crater. He left a subtraction. And subtraction doesn't photograph well. In his own universe, Saitama sat on his couch, flipping channels, annoyed that nothing held his interest. He thought briefly about the other place, the one with the loud heroes and the strange tension that never quite asked for his help. He shrugged. "Guess they figured it out," he said, without any evidence. He turned the TV off. Outside, life continued. Back in the boys' universe, the quiet never returned. Not the old quiet built on fear and suppression. A different one took its place. Uncomfortable, uncertain, permanent. A world that had learned, too late and without instruction, that the most dangerous thing to lose wasn't control. It was the illusion that control had ever belonged to them. And somewhere between the systems that failed and the people who adapted, the greatest change of all settled in. No one waited for a savior anymore. No one asked who deserved the power. They simply learned to live without assuming someone stronger would arrive. Saitama never knew. And because of that, the world stayed changed. Forever,